So we are joined now by the co-founders of DropSite, Ryan Grim, our own Ryan Grim, and Jeremy Scahill. Great to see you both.
Good to see you guys.
Good to see you guys. How you doing?
So you all are up this morning with an explosive piece of reporting. I want to go ahead and put this up on the screen. Jeremy, you spoke to a number of top Hamas officials. The headline here is "On the Record with Hamas." In a DropSiteNews exclusive, Hamas officials discussed their motivations, political objectives, and the human cost of their armed uprising against Israel. I want to get into the specifics of the piece, but before we do that, actually, Jeremy, I'd like you to talk about how this is reflective of what you intend to do with DropSite and why we haven't seen any reporting like this, which I think is incredibly critical to understand, the mindset of both sides of the conflict, why we don't see this sort of thing in really hardly any other outlet.
I mean, look, Krystal, we're in the midst of a sustained genocide in Gaza that's gone on. Now it's entering its 10th month, that has been armed, bankrolled, politically, diplomatically, legally supported by the most powerful nation in the world, by the Biden administration, and by the entirety of the U.S. national security apparatus. And we're being told that this is such an urgent cause that we have to just pour weapons into pummeling 2.3 million people trapped inside of what is essentially an open-air prison. And the justification for this is that around 1,100 Israelis, 695 of whom were civilians, were killed on October 7th. And I think it's journalistic malpractice not to speak to the individuals who organized this and to understand what their motivation was for it, because this is a tremendously consequential policy on the part of the United States government. Our primary goal is to hold our own government accountable. But also, this is a genocide that we're watching unfold in real time. And I think that it's of great public interest to actually speak to the people that organized the attack that then spurred this massive genocidal response from Israel. Dan Rather interviewed Saddam Hussein. CNN had reporters go and interview Osama bin Laden. I've interviewed members of Al-Qaeda before. I think this is basic journalistic practice that should be embraced, not demonized. But I know how people are going to respond to this. I mean, look what happens when just some networks interview a Republican. People lose their minds. So, I won't apologize for it at all. I think it's a vital journalistic role to go and interview people you're told are the enemy.
That is so obvious and yet so lacking and
so controversial.
And yet so controversial. So yeah, Jeremy, why don't you give us some of the specifics? You spoke on the record with senior Hamas leaders here in the midst of this ceasefire negotiation. Give us an insight into their thinking. Yeah, please.
I mean, I'll give you some news. So right now, there's you have CIA Director William Burns and other U.S. officials from Qatar, Egypt, Israel, and also from Hamas. That are now trying to restart these negotiations to try to see if there can be, at a minimum, some form of a temporary ceasefire so there could be an exchange of captives. And over the weekend, Netanyahu sort of blew this up again, and apparently behind the backs even of his own negotiators went and leaked to the media 4 things that he said were non-negotiables in these in these discussions that are taking place between Israel, Hamas, and the mediators. And some of them are basic things like he wants an end to smuggling of weapons across the Rafah crossing from Egypt. He doesn't want Hamas fighters to be able to return to the north of Gaza. He wants a maximum number of living Israeli hostages returned to Israel. But the big one is, he said, Israel is not going to budge on our commitment to continue the war to total victory at a time of our choosing. And this is basically the most inflammatory aspect of this. And there had been indications, and I got some of this from Hamas, that Hamas was willing to kind of not entirely back off of a demand for a full and permanent ceasefire, but to allow for an incremental staged settlement or resolution with Israel that would, at the onset, result in the exchange of some prisoners. There are thousands and thousands of Palestinians. And on that micro level, one of the sticking points is that Hamas leaders told me that one of their primary goals of the October 7th attacks was to take as many Israeli soldiers prisoner as possible and bring them back to Gaza, because they don't just want to get Palestinian women and children out of Israeli prisons. They want to get combatants. They want people that are Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters, some of whom are serving life sentences or multiple life sentences in Israel for killing Israelis. And the Israeli government has said, no, we will not release anyone that has Jewish blood on their hands. And Yahya Sinwar, the Gaza-based head of Hamas, one of the 3 or 4 main organizers of the October 7th attacks, spent 22, 23 years in an Israeli prison, and he himself was freed in 2011 in this very type of deal, where an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, was returned to Israel, and then 1,030 plus Palestinians were freed, including Yahya Sinwar, the man that would then go on to be the main organizer of Al-Aqsa flood on October 7th.
Ryan, what is your sense of where we are with the ceasefire negotiations? I'd love you to tie this in also with something we've been talking ad nauseum about, which is President Biden's manifest decline. It's my impression that on domestic policy, he's sort of handed over the reins to the rest of the staff, but for better and largely worse, he hangs on with his death grip to foreign policy, in spite of the fact, obviously, the Netanyahu bear hug strategy has completely failed. His latest humiliation is he gave this big speech. Oh, Israel has put forward this incredibly generous ceasefire proposal. Meanwhile, Bibi's out there saying things like, well, my condition of ceasefire is that I can go back to fighting this war. So it seems very unlikely that we're going to achieve a ceasefire so long as Israel is committed to not having a ceasefire.
Yeah, Biden really ties his worth as president to his foreign policy acumen, which is, we can set the irony of that aside, given the fact that he's been wrong on almost every foreign policy issue that he's weighed in on in like 50 years. But when he talks publicly about why he ought to be elected, that's immediately what he goes to. He's got NATO here this week, and he feels like if he can look like a president around NATO and then also bring together a ceasefire, and not a ceasefire because he wants a ceasefire to this war in particular, because McGurk and Blinken have convinced him that, I think, that if he can get a Saudi-Israel deal, that kind of cinches it for him, that like settles his legacy as this great foreign policy thinker. And it will also overshadow the questions about his ability to finish thoughts and to complete sentences, and whether or not he's just too old and frail to actually serve as president. So I think he sees a ceasefire, or at least a pause, kind of as a necessary condition to get to the next step, which is what he wants, which is Saudi-Israeli normalization, which he thinks then it would be his like kind of landmark legacy project. But like you said, Netanyahu is now in July and staring at the prospect of a likely Trump presidency in November. Netanyahu is a political adversary of Democrats generally and of Biden in particular. So Netanyahu is going to do everything he can to prolong this war for his own survival, and also to get to that place where Trump is president, where then he feels like he's got to reset.
Jeremy, could you speak some to, because this has been discussed previously, the way that these normalization deals, which were started under Trump and then continued under Biden, the way those played into the impetus for the October 7th attacks by Hamas?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And, the status quo for, 20 plus years has been, and this has been the approach of many Arab nations, that there isn't going to be any more landmark peace agreements or normalization agreements with Israel if it doesn't include a robust addressing of the question of Palestinian statehood and the condition under which Palestinians are living. And so from the perspective of Hamas, they watched as Donald Trump and Jared Kushner embraced Netanyahu's principle, which is that the Palestinians should have no veto over Israel's ability to create new relationships in the Middle East. And, actually 2 weeks before October 7th, Netanyahu gave a speech at the United Nations. It was a largely empty chamber. It was just sort of his little minions were in there. But he talked about a new vision for the Middle East that connects, Europe, that connects Asia to Europe. And he holds up a map, and there is no Palestine on it. Palestinians were entirely erased from the map. And that was, symbolic of what had happened under Trump. And then Biden comes into office. Biden picks up the mantle from Jared Kushner and says, we're going to keep going full steam ahead with these agreements. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are watching this, and they're like, no way. So part of their stated rationale for the October 7th attacks was to try to derail these agreements. I don't think that they were deluding themselves into believing that they would succeed in that, because as Mouin Rabbani pointed out to me in my piece, Palestinian blood has never stopped these Arab nations from making any kind of an agreement with Israel. But I think what is true is that Hamas and Islamic Jihad were sending a message to Arab populations in countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan and elsewhere that you better not let your governments make these deals with Israel at the cost of Palestinian lives. I think, though, Krystal, it's really important to say The main objective, I think, of the October 7th attack was to call the question on the siege, the blockade, the prison of Gaza. Hamas was starting to get blamed by Palestinians in Gaza for their life conditions, which was the aim of Israel's collective punishment strategy of putting them on a calorie-restricted diet, mowing the lawn through regular military operations. Opinion polling suggested that people were getting really furious with Hamas. So I think on a political level, all of these things converged, and Hamas said, it's now or never. They were in trouble internally within Gaza. They were watching the annexations spreading. They were watching the situation at Al-Aqsa Mosque being defiled, the holiest site in Islam in Palestine. They were watching these agreements being brokered that cut Palestine out of the deal. And they said, this has to be our stand. And I think that I believe it. I think that is sincerely what they wanted to do. They wanted to shatter the paradigm, irrevocably.
Yeah, Jeremy, what was fascinating reading your piece is the surprise by Hamas leaders at how successful October 7th was. The surprise also of the number of civilians that they were able to capture in the subsequent fallout. You talk about the prisoner's dilemma that they're now in with respect to the ceasefire. Could you break that down of what that looks like for the audience?
Yeah, this is really important. My understanding is that the primary objective in terms of taking, what Israel calls hostages, what Hamas calls prisoners, was soldiers, because they can get a much higher price for the soldiers. As I mentioned, they wanted to get the impossibles. They also wanted to, the impossibles, meaning these guys who have been locked up for charges that they murdered Israelis or that they're armed terrorists. They also wanted to free other Palestinians, but their primary objective was to get their own people out. On this issue, though, I'm told, and I think that there is reason to believe it, that when the second and third wave of people then start pouring across the prison walls and fences that Hamas blew apart, and they started entering Israel, individual groups of people start also snatching Israelis, elderly women, children, and others, and bringing them back to Gaza. And so, I heard from both Hamas and from an Israeli negotiator that is currently working to try to free Israelis from Gaza and deals with Hamas, that on the fourth day after October 7th, Hamas was basically begging Netanyahu to take a bunch of the civilians back. Hamas was not equipped to hold them. They didn't want to have them. They didn't consider them valuable. They had an enormous number of soldiers, way beyond what they thought they would get. And the Netanyahu government refused. Netanyahu was insisting that he was going to address this militarily. And so, both Israeli negotiators and Hamas have confirmed to me that not only did Hamas not want to be holding large numbers of civilians, they actually actively tried to give them back.
And Ryan, final question to you. This is Jeremy's piece in his reporting, but you're obviously deeply familiar with it as well. I mean, one of the key questions is, how did Hamas view the civilian deaths and injuries and kidnappings of Israelis on October 7th? And how have they viewed the massive amount of Palestinian civilian deaths that have occurred, as a result of their actions? Obviously, Israel is to blame. They're the ones dropping the bombs. But Hamas knew that this would trigger a massive response. What is their view of those civilian deaths?
Right. There's obviously some cynicism involved, and also some, what would you call it? Just kind of cold-blooded calculus, in the sense that Jeremy can talk more at length about this, but they obviously understood that there would be an Israeli response that would be catastrophic and would result in civilian casualties. Now, they did not expect that they would succeed as significantly as they did, which means that they didn't expect the extent of the bombing campaign. They've talked about saying, well, we expected, similar to the past, several weeks, maybe even months of a relentless bombing campaign, ending with a prisoner exchange and a ceasefire deal. So they got more than they bargained for. At the same time, the Palestinian cause is probably at its highest place internationally, than it has been in many decades, perhaps since the first mostly nonviolent intifada. And so that raises these really uncomfortable and thorny ethical questions about about military and strategic and geopolitical aims and the costs to civilian lives, to civilian lives, without, of course, excusing any kind of Israeli slaughter. That doesn't mean it's justified to respond in the way Israel has.
One last point on that, Krystal. I heard different perspectives on this question from different people within Hamas. I get the sense that they're still struggling with how to answer that question. You know, on the one hand, I had a Hamas official say to me, you know, this is a really sensitive question that you're asking, and I don't think any of us expected this level of a genocidal war. And then others are saying, listen, what do you expect us to die peacefully? To just let you continue to slowly murder us, kill us off, kill us at checkpoints, kill us in drone strikes, starve us to death, deny us medical care, you know, and sort of entrenched in that position of saying, you know, this is on Israel that they did it. We had a right to rise up against them. These are occupiers. We were legitimately engaged in armed resistance as recognized under international law. I don't get the sense that they have a central party line on this question. And it's quite interesting to hear the debate. It's why I also spoke to people like Rashid Khalidi and Susan Abu Hawa, the famous Palestinian novelist, because they represent different perspectives that exist in the broader Palestinian diaspora.
Yeah.
Well, I really recommend people read the entire piece, which is up on DropSiteNews.com, right? I'm getting the web address right. And congrats to both of you. I'm so excited about what you're up to. I can't wait to see what else you have in store for us. And I really, really hope that our audience and others out there support the work that you're doing, which is difficult and expensive and thankless and controversial and all of those things. Ryan, why don't you just tell people what they should do to support you guys?
Yeah, and yesterday, you guys supported us, you know, bigly, as our man would say.
We did our goodest job at that, Ryan.
We did our goodest job.
At DropSiteNews.com. You can just sign up to get the free alerts. I think, you know, we're almost at 100,000. I think we're 95,000.
That's fantastic.
Subscribers. So, you know, today you guys can put us over the top of that. If you can, you know, support it financially, do that. But if not, that's also okay. The journalism will always be free. You know, we'll be on here a lot talking about, you know, the results of our investigations. But if you can support it, you know, you can do that right there at DropSiteNews.com or donate.dropsitenews.com too.
Well, we look forward to that, and thank you both. Great to see you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.